Hey, Ralph, it's Brock. I just want to check my mic.
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, and I'm going to check my video.
Okay, that's good too.
Great. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Brown. No audio.
I'm here.
Good, sounds good. Okay, I have a little after 9 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and take myself off. And Commissioner France, all yours. And Tammy's on 2.
Yep, good morning.
Okay. No audio, Commissioner.
Okay, how about now? Is that
Yes.
better? Good, all right. Phew. All right, welcome everyone to the October Board Natural Resources meeting. Let's start with actions. Franz, Commissioner of Lands. Andre. Dean Wright, I should say.
I'm Andre Wright. I'm Dean of the College of Agricultural, Human, and Natural Resource Sciences at Washington State University.
Jim Cahill.
Good morning, Jim Cahill, Senior Budget Assistant for Natural Resources at the Office of Financial Management, representing the Governor.
Professor Brown.
Hi, I'm Dan Brown, Director, School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington.
And do we, those are the I can see, so do we have Superintendent Rachel? Okay.
Commissioner.
What about, oh, go ahead. Commissioner, let's do repeat. Okay.
Yeah, I don't yet see Superintendent, and I don't see Commissioner Beach yet.
Okay. All right, well, First, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to move to the webinar format briefing. Tammy, you want to take it away?
Good morning, everybody. Just an FYI, I got an email just now from Commissioner Pete that he will join meeting in progress. So welcome everybody to the October 6th Board of Natural Resources meeting via webinar. My name is Tammy Kellogg and I'm your board coordinator. I'm going to take a few minutes this morning to go over how this webinar is planned to run today. Many of you are likely familiar with the structure of the Board of Natural Resources meetings. This webinar is structured to largely match our traditional board meetings. That said, there are some key differences. There are a couple of different ways people are attending today. Some of you have called into this meeting and are listening on your phones. That is the listen only option for the meeting. Many of you have logged into the webinar through your computer or mobile device and are able to see and hear the presentation and conversations. If you did log in through the webinar, you also have the opportunity to sign up to make public comment during the comment periods for today's meetings, or you have the option to just listen. You check the box to provide comment, your name is registered on a list, and you will be called upon during the comment period. Currently, a list is being compiled of the names of individuals who would like to provide comments today. Once the list is completed, it will be forwarded to Commissioner Franz, and she will call on you when it is your turn to speak. As always, we ask that you keep your comments to 3 minutes. There are several of us working behind the scenes today, such as Ralph Johnson. Ralph is in charge of many things, not the least of which is unmuting you when it is time to speak. Please be aware that if you are an attendee, your microphones will be muted during the meeting. If you signed up to speak, our organizer will unmute you so that you can provide comment. In contrast, board members have control of their microphones throughout the meeting. If you are on the telephone listening or having technical difficulties, if you registered wrong, or are having trouble figuring out how to register to speak at the public comment periods, we do have an email set up where you can request assistance. You are able to email Kenny at kenny.ocker@dnr.wa.gov. That's kenny.ocker@dnr.wa.gov. Kenny's email address is also at the bottom of the slide and is also listed at the bottom of the instructions for attending the meeting that are posted online. And now I hand this back to you, Commissioner Franz, for the next item on the agenda. Commissioner Franz, you're muted.
I don't know what's going on with my technology today. All right. For next up on the agenda is approval of the September 12th, 2020 Board of Natural Resources meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded to approve September 12th, 2020 Board of Natural Resources meeting minutes. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Next up is public comments for general items of interest. I think Ralph is still comprising those, so we're going to have to take a few minutes here.
Commissioner, this is Angus.
Yes. Yes.
While we're waiting, we could do a short presentation about fires.
Sure, I think that is fine. Board members, obviously it's been a pretty significant end of summer with what we saw and experienced on Labor Day, which I'm now calling sort of Firestorm 2020. The reality is starting Labor Day with hurricane force winds, we saw an unprecedented number of fires where literally in 72 hours, 600,000 acres burned. It is 5 times the amount of total acres burned in 2019. for the entire year. It is more than double the amount of acres that burned in 2015, when 1 million acres burned, and it was the worst wildfire season in record. I will say it was just on Labor Day alone, we had 53 fires start. Quickly by the end of that day, we had 13 pretty significant catastrophic fires. By the next day, another 26 fires had started as well. We had limited resources and capacity both at the local and the state and federal level, given neighboring states that were on fire, Oregon and California especially, in much more significant severe situation. But in those 72 hours and the weeks that followed, it was one of the most challenging in my career, frankly, as not only did we tragically lose the life of a small boy as his family tried to outrun that fire up in Cold Springs in the northeast corner of our state, but we saw an entire town be completely destroyed and demolished. The fact is these catastrophic fires continue to hit our landscape, not just in central and eastern Washington, but in the entire state. And when you add the forest condition, hot, dry fuels, the grasslands, hot, dry fuels, coupled with more and more people living in proximity to our forest areas, coupled with the reality of increasing hurricane force winds that we saw, which was unprecedented, it makes it very, very difficult for us to fight these fires, including made it very difficult for us to utilize our air resources, which are #1 on initial attack for us in helping get on those fires quickly and keep them small. We thought it would be a good opportunity. As you know, we've been pushing hard and aggressively on forest health. It has been my top priority, along with securing the resources we need to be able to fight these fires at the state and local level. But to be able to restore the health of our forests in central and eastern Washington, as well as now in western Washington, on both federal, state, and private lands and tribal. We thought it'd be a good opportunity for Angus to present to you what transpired in those significant weeks that followed Labor Day, how it impacted our state lands and forest areas, as well as the work that we've been doing in forest health. So Angus, I'm going to turn it over to you for an opportunity to just dive in deeper.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And for the record, my name is Angus Brody. I'm the Deputy Supervisor for State Uplands. I will put on my video so you can see me. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see the screen, which is a map of the large fires in Washington in this year. The map actually shows that is as of mid-September, so the 18th of September, of the large fires and the extent of those. Large fires are defined as being 100 acres in size or greater. And then, as you can see, there's a few statistics in the box up on the right-hand side of the screen. The statewide coverage of fires, nearly 823,000 acres. The majority of those, as you can see, were contained in 42 large fires. When we say statewide, that means both on federal as well as private or state lands. Those fires under DNR's jurisdiction, you can see there 200 and almost 60,000 acres, and nearly almost 1,000 fires. Of large fires, there being 23, and as you can see, it is the majority of those acres again. As you can see from the map, the large fires outlined in red cover those across state that impacted state lands, or some portion of them impacting state lands. The majority of those fires covered around 52,000 acres of state lands, and the majority of those lands being grassland, agricultural lands, and some other lands covered by those existing fires. Of forests that were impacted by these fires in this year, around 3,500 acres. The majority of those was in the Evans Canyon fire, which is here in central Washington. And the other around 800 acres were also impacted in the Big Hollow fire, which is down in Skamania County. The big hollow fire also actually impacted an active timber sale called Variety, of which was purchased by Hampton, and they were in the state in actually active logging, and a couple of the units were impacted that were as part of that fire. What we know to date is about 10 to 15 acres of felled and butt timber in one of the units of the big hollow fire of the Variety timber sale was impacted by that big hollow fire. We don't yet have estimates of what value was lost to the purchaser, but I imagine it's been pretty significant. That gives you a sort of broad overview of the impact of the fires this year. This all happened pretty much in the month of September, as Commissioner described. The turning events of a very dry summer, and then these easterly winds that came around the Labor Day weekend expanded the extent of these fires enormously during that period. I'll hand it back to you, Commissioner, see if there's any other comments you would like to make, or if there's any questions from the board. You're still muted. I have you unmuted.
Okay, I'm not able to control it. Somebody on the other side is controlling my mute. So Ralph, I need you to unmute me. I think a lot of what we saw, first of all, obviously the hurricane force winds were quite significant and unprecedented. I heard from fire chiefs who not seen something like that ever, actually, frankly. And they've been in service for 25, 30 years. What was not surprising is the speed with which the fires burned, the context of how volatile the fuel load is and how intense, and how limited our resources are, frankly, in fighting these fires. I think I will continue to press upon you as board members, as well as the public, as well as our leaders in this state, that we continue to underinvest significantly in state and local firefighting resources and in the work that needs to happen on the ground to make our forests and landscapes more resilient and our communities more resilient. We had firefighters literally fighting with skeleton crews because we could not get incident management teams from at the federal level because they were all fully utilized in California and Oregon. And it was unbelievable what the men and women did with so little resources. You'll hear a lot more about it come legislative session, but I want to turn it over to you guys to have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Board members?
This is Bill Peach.
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner Peach. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You know, when I take a look at the need for resiliency and increasing our fire management, and you mentioned that the aircraft suppression wasn't as effective as you'd hoped. What are you proposing that will help us resolve that and improve our ability to attack fire?
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Peach, let me say, first of all, we leverage our air resources. The moment there is smoke in the air, we attack our fires immediately. It is a huge change that we put in place in 2017 following the 2014 through 2016 fires. It is why we've been able to keep 90% of our fires below 10 acres. It's why before Labor Day, while we had more fires and significant amount of fires, we were able to get on them quickly. We have 11 air resources, so we are limited in the number of air resources when we have an enormous amount of fires on the landscape. But what was difficult about this Labor Day weekend that proceeded to have 600,000 acres burned was that the hurricane force winds made it completely impossible for our air resources to fly. They were grounded because of safety of the pilots, which is number one, paramount importance is the safety of our firefighters. With that, all we had was our resources on the ground, our firefighters getting into these very tough conditions because the fire moved quickly. For example, the fire in Malden, that fire hit, the mayor of that small town was driving out of town to deliver, she delivers grain for a local wheat farmer as one of her jobs. On the return, everything was normal. On the return, 20 minutes later, that entire town was completely engulfed in flames. The hurricane force winds moved that fire so quickly through that town, within hours it was completely destroyed. That community only has 8 local firefighters. The region only has 25 local volunteer firefighters. The underinvestment in our local fire districts and communities who are on the front line year after year in wildfire fighting is holding us back from being able to protect our communities, protect our landscapes. In addition to that piece is look at Cold Spring fire. The largest fire in the state was Cold Spring and the Pearl Hill. That 600,000 acres that burned in 72 hours, over 400,000 of that was the Cold Spring and Pearl Hill fires. Those fires moved in 5 hours over 60 miles. And that is because of those winds that were unprecedented, in some places over 70 miles per hour. So it made it impossible for us to use air resources. Now, our hope is these winds are going to be uncommon, although they're unpredictable, like nature is. We will need to continue to invest in air resources so that we, as we fight from March until October, these fires on both sides of the mountain, we'll be able to get on top of them quickly and put them out. A perfect example is the fire at Lake Crescent in your community, where fortunately very little damage happened because we had an enormous amount of air resources on that fire really quickly. Another example is the fire at Evans Canyon, which was we were able to largely get contained right before Labor Day. We had 21 air resources on that fire because we had very few fires outside in other parts of the state, and we were able to bring those air resources in. Now, once those winds were dying down and the winds, we were able to fly again. We did have challenges because of smoke. You can't fly in those conditions. As we know, we had the worst air quality in the world from Spokane to Seattle and on, largely from the California fires, as well as Oregon and some of our own smoke. Once we were able, though, to fly, limited air resources were available other than what we had in our own control, which is our helicopters, and then we have fixed wing on contract. And that's because California and Oregon were in far more significant fire danger with far more population and communities at risk, and they had already consumed and gotten a hold of those fires those resources similar to the incident management teams. We were able to secure resources from Montana, and we were able to secure resources from BC when it came to air resources. But the biggest challenge of this fire that we experienced in September was the hurricane force winds that grounded our air resources, making it very, very difficult to get on those fires quickly and contain them and put them out, coupled with limited resources at the local and state level, where we are too often dependent on other states or the federal government to help us out.
And I appreciate the observations of the value of local.
Commissioner, or Angus, could you talk about, we know we had hurricane force winds, but what was the cause of the starts of so many fires? And how do we think we can help with that issue moving forward?
Yeah, so great question. On average, every single year, 90% of our fires are caused by humans. And so that can be everything from debris pile burning or debris burning to campfires to a downed utility pole to chains dragging on asphalt and then a spark, and it quickly moves over to the side of the road. And then we've got a lot of dry grass and dry debris on those sides of the road, as you know. We believe, while investigations are still going on, that every one of the fires that started Labor Day for the next week to week was human caused. There was no lightning, and therefore it is very likely that it's human caused, unintentional or intentional. And again, human cause does mean a down power utility pole, right? It could be a tire falling off a car and the metal spark off of the, the wheel moving over into the grass and starting the fire. So we obviously, part of our work has been trying to get information and education out. We actually partnered with insurance companies this year, as well as the utilities, to be able to get the word out about people reducing chance of fire starting, especially given COVID and the risk that it presented to our firefighters. Obviously, our communication and marketing and messaging budget is pretty small, especially given COVID. So we try to use our local fire districts, our own sort of networks, as well as news media to get that information out. But again, 90% of our fires are caused by humans. So while much of this feels out of control, from the hurricane force winds to the hot conditions, in fact, we can take steps in 3 areas. One is preventing the fires in the first place and helping every single person in Washington State understand what they can do to prevent them. The majority of the fires we've had to date this year are debris pile burns. So there's huge education. One of the things we did earlier this year, partnering with insurance, because so much of the debris piles that fires started was on people's property. This piece is obviously what you've heard me say many, many times, which is actually helping restore the health of our landscapes. We have a goal and targeted of treating 1.25 million acres of forest in central eastern Washington. Half of that is federal lands. We will be in the next 2 months coming out with the forest health plan for the west side of the state, and the targets for forest health measures, as well as targets that we need to help restore the health of the west side forests, as we see 40% of our fires now on the west side. I will be pushing hard this legislative session, Jim, I'm sure you know that, in that work. We are also having significant conversations at the federal level with the federal delegation and Natural Resources Committee leadership. And the other third piece, which is very significant now focus, is the community resilience side. It's interesting, our conversation later today on climate resilience, because it'll come in there. But the fact is, just one look at the town of Malden, where a majority of those homes were completely leveled and destroyed. All that was left was foundation and chimney. Many of those homes uninsured, many of them low income, limited resources, young families. What was startling, besides the complete devastation and destruction of that community in just a few hours, was the fact that you also saw on postage stamp lots, house by house close to each other destroyed, and then one house amongst all of that rubble and destruction completely untouched. The grass was green, trees were intact, there was not even a singe mark on the home. I have been pushing for the importance of community resilience, of how we create defensible space around our homes, we create defensible space around our communities, how we make our forests more resilient. Every homeowner has the ability to take steps to protect their homes. It is part of our responsibility, I believe, to help them have the tools and resources to do that. You will see a push in our legislative priorities and package this year, a third leg of the stool, which is that community resilience piece. So we are preventing the threat and risk to lives, not only our residents, but also our firefighters, because structural fires and protecting those communities is very, very hard and very, very dangerous and risky.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner, I think we're ready with the list of public who want to comment.
Yes, and I'm struggling because I have email, but I do not have the speakers list. Oh, there, let's see, maybe I do. Hold on, I got it. All right. All right, we're gonna start. We first have up Lisa Remlinger, followed by Joe Beavers.
Great. Good morning, Commissioner and board members, and thank you for the wildfire update. My name is Lisa Remlinger. I used to be the Forest Program Director for Washington Environmental Council. and I'm now the Chief Policy Officer overseeing our work on climate, fossil fuels, Puget Sound, and forests. Before taking on this new role, one of my last efforts was to participate in the solutions table. Many in our community, both externally and internally, even within my own organization, were skeptical this effort would succeed, and unfortunately it did not. That was both parts disappointing and frustrating. Now, almost a year later, those meetings and that time seems ago, especially given the topic we just discussed. We are now in a different world. A global pandemic, reckoning with catastrophic wildfires, where one of those could have meant substantial change. We are now trying to figure out all three. And with the exception of wildfire, it may be easy to think that those other societal changes don't affect the BNR, but then you probably realize that that is not the case. In a way, they present new opportunities for our state, this agency, and this board to be better coming out than they were going in. Because at the end of the day, the problems we had before have not been solved. Rural communities are still hurting, species are continuing to decline, and climate change, as we just discussed, is still altering our landscape. We've known all along that embracing broader responsibility demands complex solutions, collaborative engagement, and statewide resources. And my guess is most, although not all of the people that were part of the solutions table still want to make progress. Maybe our next effort doesn't look exactly like the solutions table or have exactly the same people, but we need to do something. Our world may look and feel different, and it is, but we also have new opportunities to make it better. Our community continues to have ideas, we continue to want to work together, and we hope that the board and commissioner feel the same. I look forward to hearing from you on what's next in this space. And with that, thank you for this time.
Joe Beavers.
Joe Beavers, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can, Mr. Beavers.
Joe Beavers, Gold Bar. At last month's board meeting, two persons trying to impede DNR's harvesting of timber referred to DNR personnel as hypocrites and liars. I was appalled by those statements. I have interacted with multiple DNR personnel since early 2008. Besides being highly competent, they, without exception, have been poised, professional, and polite. Citizens in Washington are blessed to have such a fine group of people working for them. Those statements made at the last meeting reflect only upon the ones making them. Thank you.
Jim Stoffer, followed by Beverly Parsons. Is Jim Stoffer there? Ralph, do we have Jim Stoffer on?
Yeah, he's on. He's self-muted right now.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. There we go.
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Stoffer.
Yeah, it's kind of the same problem. Someone needs to unmute me before we can unmute on the other side. Hi, good morning, Commissioner and Board. My name is Jim Stoffer. I'm Board Director from Squin School District, but I'm here on behalf of WASDA, where I sit on the WASDA Trust Lands Committee. I'm also a member of DNR's Forest Health Advisory Committee. WASDA just wrapped up our legislative conference past weekend, where we go through our legislative process of legislative priorities. Several are will align, or we can partner with DNR on several of those items, from broadband to forest revenue apportionment, comprehensive school safety, where the seismic studies falls in, school construction revenue. And so I just, we look forward to that process, that ongoing engagement with DNR staff. And we are here walking the same path and concerned about our communities and especially our schools. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Beverly Parsons, followed by Patricia Jones.
Hi, this is Beverly Parsons. Actually, Carol Price is here with me, and she's going to speak at this time. I'll be speaking at a later point. Thank you. This is Carol Price. Can you hear me? I'm a lifelong resident of Washington State and have lived in Kitsap County for 25 years. Climate crisis is upon us. The United Nations scientists say we have 10 years to establish climate resilience. Washington citizens have expressed their concerns to the DNR about forest practices in their communities. We have tried to express why we care about these public trust lands and what they mean to us. The Middle May timber sale near Gold Bar, next to Wallace State Park. Residents want to add Middle May acres to the existing park. The city theater acres in Jefferson County have been foraged for medicinal plants of the Endeavor Club for years. The Tip-Top sale on the Tahoyah Peninsula in Mason County is a 100-year-old habitat containing giant cedars. The Ridgetop acreage in Silverdale has been used by the community for educational purposes. Most recently, we were made aware of the proposed cut in the Agawam Rose Point Forest in North Kitsap, our backyard. While vested local officials, the timber industry, lobbyists, and the DNR work among themselves on these sales, the larger community is left out of the process. The practice of clear-cutting forests on public lands provides one-time monetary gain, but impacts our public lands and surrounding communities for many decades. This healthy forest absorbed greenhouse gases. A moratorium on the clear-cutting and deforestation of trees is one of the most significant actions the state of Washington DNR can take to positively impact the climate crisis. A 10-year moratorium on clear cutting of Northwest forests would give the state and its citizens time to reassess how our forests are being managed. It is time to change the Forest Practices Act and other laws governing timber harvests in this state. And I know you all don't want to hear this. I urge the Washington State DNR to stop all sales of trees on public lands now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Patricia Jones, followed by Paula Seden. Patricia Jones.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Dr. Patricia Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of the Olympic Forest Coalition based on the Olympic Peninsula. I'm here with my colleagues who represented conservation on Commissioner Fran's Solutions Table. My organization asked the Commissioner and you, the Board of Natural Resources, and the Legislature to bring together a multi-stakeholder task force to find a path forward for the murrelet and our communities. Our families and neighbors depend on the emergency services, public safety, education, healthcare, and libraries. The Commissioner sought a process that could find positive solutions to our challenges, and the Solutions Table was formed. My organization was honored to be invited to participate and to work with such a qualified group of people on potentially win-win solutions. We were hopeful because we work with the timber industry on sales on federal forests that both promote ecological restoration and generate revenue, jobs, and timber. We were hopeful also because the task was so urgent, given the murrelet population decline and the environmental challenges that Commissioner Franz and Mr. Brody just outlined, that focusing the resources of the DNR, conservation, timber, and beneficiaries in a concerted effort to bring the best thinking and experience to play for communities and murrelets. I want to say thank you to the Commissioner and especially the DNR staff for their professional work on the table. I'm here to note that before you in the next few months are timber sales that will directly impact the murrelets. They will be the first of the stands and the alternatives supported by federal and state agencies as the more ecological approach that should end up after 50 years with better murrelet populations and healthier forests. These sales were a part of a solution put forward to the table. Our efforts were unilaterally blocked in the 11th hour by timber interests just saying no to the creative and promising solutions that found support on the table. You may think, well, that's just how the process goes. We have overwhelming examples of the business as usual paradigm no longer being a workable path forward for Washington State. In the world we live in today, just saying no without contributing any actual solutions is just not good enough. Our organization is ready to work. We are still here. We have solutions. We see opportunities. Local companies like the Amazon Corporation and their $1 billion carbon fund. We need leadership from our elected officials to step up to the moment, roll up our sleeves, and get to the serious work of saving our communities and our forests. You are or represent our leaders. We are still hopeful. We are ready. Thank you.
Next up is Paula Seden.
Good morning, friends and members of the board. My name is Paula Seden, and I'm the Policy Director for Conservation Northwest. Our mission is to connect, protect, and restore the wildlands and wildlife of the Pacific Northwest. And we seek collaborative solutions to difficult conservation issues and partner with landowners and residents of rural areas. Along with my colleagues, I was honored to have the opportunity to participate in Commissioner Franz's solutions table. We enthusiastically embraced the goals which Commissioner Franz set out, which were best embodied in her invitation letter. And I quote, "In order to move forward, we have to reject the notion that we are stuck in a zero-sum game, one which forces us to choose between a species and ensuring critical services and opportunities for our communities. Instead, we must open up to the idea that shared success is achievable and develop strategies for mutual benefit." I was really inspired by that. And again, like colleagues, was really inspired to participate with a bunch of people who had, for a period of time, a lot of good energy to try to attain goals. We devoted significant we listened carefully to representatives of the other interests. And hey, can someone mute? I think there's a lot of background noise. It's not coming from me. We listened carefully to representatives of the interests and crafted ideas with the intent to solve beneficiary revenue issues and contribute to local economies. An example of an idea is creating a new rural resilience trust in which new income-producing assets could be pooled and revenue distributed to timber counties impacted by the multiple challenges they have faced over the past 30 years. Complementary to this would be using the historically low cost of debt to finance the acquisition of these new assets and create a portfolio that includes sustainable forest management for both wood products and carbon sequestration and lease properties for renewable energy development. While we made progress in building relationships, increasing mutual understanding, and developing joint proposals, we hit a wall this past January with trust among some parties breaking down. This is unfortunate, but it's not a reason to give up. We all understand that the world has thrown us significant challenges since the early part of the year, yet those challenges make it even more imperative for all of us to work towards those mutually beneficial solutions which the unraveling of our ecosystems and strengthen the economic and social resilience of our state. We ask that you not lose threads of the positive outcomes of the solutions table effort. It would be a shame to waste the goodwill of those who came to the table genuinely wanting to solve everyone's issues, not just our own. Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. That concludes public comments for general items of interest. Next up is public comment for timber sale. And if I'm correct, we have a last minute person interested in speaking, Miranda Mellis.
Hello, thank you for allowing me to speak. I just want to add my voice to the voices of those who are skeptical about continuing with the old paradigm under current conditions of climate change and forest fire. It does seem time for a paradigm shift that protects forests that are starting to have old growth characteristics, that are protective and protective of forest fire, and that protect habitat. I hear people all around the state and in my community everywhere so supportive of this paradigm shift. We need to find other ways to fund our schools and stop logging. Really time. That's our contribution as a state that we can make to carbon sequestration, habitat protection, and also taking care of workers in this process will be very important. I think people really recognize that. We don't want anyone losing jobs. We don't want schools losing funding. There are creative solutions, and it's really time for this change. So I support the moratorium on logging while we come up with a new paradigm and new solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Ralph, there's a lot, I don't know if you can help. There's an enormous amount of background noise that is actually, and I apologize to the speakers before, but everybody's figured out how to mute me. Can we figure out how to mute some of the other people that are causing the noise, Ralph? All right. With that, it's still there. With that, I'd like to call next item on the agenda, which is presentation of the timber. I believe that's Kashari.
Good morning, board members. It's nice to see you this morning. I am here with the regular presentation of our timber sales from our product sales and leasing program. I'll be providing you with our results from our September sales, as well as a quarterly update because September was the end of our first quarter of fiscal year 21, and providing the package for you for your approval. And I should be able to change the slides as well. In September, we offered 8 sales for 42.4 million board feet. The minimum bids on those were $10.2 million, and the average minimum bid was $241 per 1,000 board feet. We did sell all of those sales with the exception of a little tiny bit of a couple of sorts that just totaled under 51,000 board feet, didn't even change the number. It was some cottonwood, sawlogs, and some conifer pulp. But the minimum bids on those actually totaled $19.1 million at an average of $450 per 1,000 board feet. That number is reflective of some significantly high prices that we got that I'll discuss when I share a little bit about our market with you. Our average number of bids was 3.3 bids per sale. And as if you recall, that's often more like 2 to 2.5. So in our first quarter of fiscal year 21, we had planned, as we had presented to you in our July board meeting, we had planned to present offer 90 million board feet. In fact, we offered and sold 87 million board feet. There was one sale that had to be withdrawn because of an issue that was found prior to sale, and another sale that was added. So that's the difference of the 3 million board feet. And our current plan, you can see our current plan for our fiscal year 21 sales going forward. We have currently 169 million that will be offered in the second quarter, a little slightly less than our original plan that was put to you in July. And the remaining quarters are looking pretty static. I've also been presenting to you the information about the fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 sales that did not sell during the market to assure you that we are continuing to offer those. In our first quarter, we had 24 million board feet of our fiscal year 20 sales that we offered again, and were able to sell all of that fiscal year 20 volume that we offered. In the next quarter coming up, we plan to sell some of the fiscal year 19 volume as well as the fiscal year 20 volume. And in the third quarter coming up, we plan to sell some of the remaining of the fiscal year 19. And in the fourth quarter, we'll be trying to sell the remaining of the fiscal year 20. So that's something that I've been presenting to show you that we are re-offering those sales that did not sell previously. I wanted to share a little bit of information about what the market has done in the last few months. This graph is something that we compile every month. This is from our log price survey, and it shows every month our DNR staff reach out to the mills in the region to ask them what they would pay for logs that were delivered to their door. And we compile that information along with the bids from our sort sales to get a sense of what the market is willing to offer for sales. If you recall, when I started back in 2018, prices were at record highs and then have been fairly flat for fiscal year 19. Just in August and September, they started to climb again. And that, according to the market, that's a result of a few things. That is an increase in housing starts, increases in home remodeling as people are home during shutdowns for COVID restrictions. And in September, the prices are reflective of the decreased supply because of the amount of wood that burned in those fires, particularly in Oregon. So in September, we had some mills in Oregon that paid significant prices for our Washington wood and because of the wood that they had lost. So I forgot that just showed you our Douglas fir 2-saw and our Western hemlock 2-saw prices. And on this slide, I'm just giving you an update. The orange line is Western red cedar, and the blue line on this slide is our alder prices. So all of the different species have different prices. Cedar had a significant jump this past month. It often goes up and down, but this month was a significant price jump. So I just wanted to share that update with you. In the package that was sent to you for approval, we actually have 12 sales included in that packet for a total of 58.7 million board feet. The minimum bids on that total $21.4 million. And those minimum bids are currently reflective of delivered log prices. When we report our sales to you, those will be adjusted to stumpage after we have hired the harvesters and have a sense of what the harvesting and hauling costs will be on that. The average minimum bid that we're asking for those sales, for the sales in your packet, will be $364 per 1,000 board feet. Does anyone have any questions about the sales that were in your packet for approval?
Board members, any questions?
Okay, no questions. I would ask and recommend that all the sales be approved for auction in the coming months.
Board members, is there a motion to approve all sales to be approved for auction?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to recommend all sales be approved for auction. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Motion passes. Thank you, Kashari.
Thank you.
Next up, I believe we have public comments for land transactions. And I think, if I'm correct, there were people signed up to comment on this. So with that, we'll go straight to having Julie Armbruster join us to present on land transactions.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, well, good morning.
Well, actually, Julie, one second. I'm seeing Dr. Brown saying no, so.
Uh-oh. Let's see.
Are you able to see it, Dan?
I see a screen that's just the logo.
Okay.
Yep, that's it. That's exactly what you want.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
I will shift to. Okay, there we go. So good morning. My name is Julie Armbruster, and I'm a project manager for the transactions section. Today, I have a somewhat uncommon transaction to present involving mineral rights. State law requires that all mineral rights on trust lands be reserved from sale. However, the law does allow an exception. DNR can convey mineral rights to the federal government as long as there is no known mineral potential and if the Forest Service or if the United States owns the surface. Let's see. The Forest Service approached us recently about acquiring common school mineral rights for lands they currently own and for a parcel they're about to acquire in the Cape Horn area of Skamania County. It's within the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area. The Forest Service is acquiring property in the scenic area to prevent development depending on willing sellers and available funding. It's important to them that any third-party mineral rights holders don't exercise their rights and interfere with the conservation goals. The green on this map is the Forest Service ownership, and the cross-hatched area shows mineral rights owned by the Common School Trust. These rights were reserved in prior sales that occurred between 1917 and 1945. The white cross-hatched parcel outlined in red is the parcel that the Forest Service is in the process of acquiring. DNR would not convey the minerals on that parcel until the Forest Service owns it. A mineral review by a DNR geologist found no potential for subsurface minerals. That clears the way for DNR to convey the mineral rights under the statute. Because there's no potential, there's also no monetary value that can be placed on the rights. However, the Forest Service is paying DNR's cost to process this transaction. Because this is a school trust property right, board approval is required before we can transfer the rights to the federal government. This photo shows the general area where the mineral rights are. This ridge here is Highway 14. A couple of the parcels are up here, and one is approximately at the other end of this valley here. DNR recommends approval of Resolution 1569, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Board members, are there any questions regarding the land transaction Cape Horn Minerals? All right. Seeing there are no questions or comments, is there a motion to approve Resolution 1569?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and second to approve Resolution 1569. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Great, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next up, we have public comments for chair report. We have 4 people signed up for this, starting first with Jim Freeberg, followed by Matt Comiskey.
Good morning, my name is Jim Freeberg. I'm with the North Cascades Conservation Council, and I'm here to speak about the legislative agenda that you'll see presented in a few minutes. Absent from that agenda is the trust land transfer, which has been a program the state has been using for, I think, nearly 30 years to preserve important conservation land. And I just want to express the disappointment that the North Cascades Conservation Council has in seeing a lack of funding for trust land transfer in DNR's legislative agenda. We know there still is an effort to try and keep this alive, but we want to make sure it's on your radar and recognize that there is a place for this program to continue. There's a lot of important lands that we care about in the North Cascades at low elevations that can be preserved through the trust land transfer program. It can also help with climate change. It keeps these trees vertical where they can sequester carbon and still allow the state to receive non-tax revenue for schools and other public services. So appreciate your interest and hopefully continued support for trust land transfer in the future.
Next up is Matt.
All right, hopefully everybody can hear me. Everything froze up there when I got unmuted by the organizer. Good morning. For the record, my name is Matt Kaminsky, Washington Manager for American Forest Resource Council. Just wanted to highlight a couple quick things. One, we appreciate the department's efforts to share info on their legislative agenda. I think I've got some of their briefing materials through 6 or 7 different channels. DNR. We've reviewed some of that, continue to review it as it's been posted to OFM's website here over the last few weeks. We've already provided some feedback on the timber sale improvement aspect of it in commercial real estate, and we'll be continuing to engage in the forest health and wildfire. And then turning quickly to climate resiliency, we appreciate the cautious efforts the department appears to be going through. You'll see in the presentation to evaluate various things such as seed sources. Those of us in the forestry world know that even in very short time periods, moving seeds, trees from one seed zone to another seed zone can have significant unintended consequences. So, and then of course, you saw the briefing about the wildfire situation over Labor Day. Significant fuel loadings on federal forests due to lack of management, particularly down in Oregon, but we also saw that up in Washington with a big hollow fire. And I would just like to flag one concern with the resiliency plan that I think will be presented to you today. We can't find where there were anybody included in the business outreach that was in the forest product sector from DNR's customer base. And the fact that we store a lot of carbon in our manufactured wood products that I think you'll see mentioned in the presentation today, I think that that is something that would be really important to also have the input and engagement from the customer base. So thank you.
Next is Rick McGuire, followed by Beverly Parsons.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you. I see some.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Rick McGuire. I'm from Alpine Protection Society, and I too am here today to urge DNR's continued support for the trust land transfer program. I'm sure all of you know that the program has been one of the most successful conservation programs in our state. It's preserved many wonderful places, particularly places at low elevations, close to urban areas, and accessible to many people. Unusual places not represented in the federal lands, which are mostly at higher elevations. Commissioner Franz, I'm sure you remember our trip to the Middle Forks and Snoqualmie. It's a wonderful spot, and we feel that there's many places that can be still added to the system, and we really support DNR's continued interest in it. The DNR conservation program punches far above its weight, far above its acreage. It's a great system. It can still grow. We hope it will, and we urge DNR to continue the growth of the conservation areas program in the future, and we request that you support trust land transfer appropriations in the future. Thanks a lot.
Beverly Parsons.
Hi, I'm Dr. Beverly Parsons from Hansville, Washington. I'm here actually representing myself and not an organization, although I am part of the Kitsap Environmental Coalition, as you know from previous comments. I would like to speak to the overall climate resilience strategy. The approach presented in the climate resilience report is simply inadequate to address the climate situation that we now face. It's too limited in scope and lacks bold collaborative approaches to address our climate crisis. As you heard earlier, we need a paradigm shift. As a starting point, we need strong proactive action on the part of DNR to stop deforestation. This cannot be done single-handedly by DNR. It requires working with other agencies to rethink how school and county funding can be changed to be less reliant on timber sales and how to adjust jobs related to forestry. I'm calling on you to develop a strategy, something very specific here, to cease all clear cutting of state forest lands for 10 years. And to do so in a way that does not result in an overall reduction of jobs from forestry in the state. I'm calling on you to engage the multiple state and county agencies, not trying to do it yourself with others, but those multiple state and county agencies, along with companies, citizens, tribes, and foundations to creatively make this possible. Together, we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you. That includes public comments on chair reports. Is chair start with the climate resiliency plan, which will be presented by Dan Stoning.
Yeah, good morning, Commissioner. This is Angus again.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to these two presentations, and then I'll hand it over to Dan. As I've committed to in the past, is to bring, some regular updates to the board around what we're doing in state lands in reference to climate and to carbon work. And so this is going to be the first of a number of updates that we'll provide over the next year or so. And as I say, hopefully these will be in preparation for further discussions of, looking at and examining a policy related to carbon and or to climate as we examine both our sustainable harvest on the east and west side, and also as we look at the overall authorities and policies around trust lands as part of our trust land performance assessment work. And if you remember, those are the sort of three main projects, policy level projects, that the board will be engaged with over the next year or so. So that will be the first presentation, and Dan will kick this off and provide an overview with Calvin and Jeff providing more detailed work of what actually we're doing in the programs themselves in state lands, or some examples. The second presentation is going to be around our legislative priorities, and Dwayne and Brock very graciously offered to present those legislative priorities, and as you will see, there are a number of them for state uplands. And as we've had a few comments around trust land performance today, trust land transfer, at the end of that presentation, I'll just touch on that about what we're looking at doing in the future around trust land transfer. Okay, with that, I'll hand it over to Dan to take it away. Okay, thanks, Dan.
Okay, thanks, Angus. Can everyone hear me okay? And we've got the slides up that everyone can see. Okay, all right, Excellent. So my name is Dan Stonington. I'm Executive Policy Advisor at DNR. I focus on climate change. And today, Calvin Olson-Keene and Jeff DeBell and I are going to give a presentation on our work around climate resilience. I'll provide an overview of DNR's recently released plan for climate resilience. So I'd like to start with just this reminder that DNR does a lot of things, from forest land management, ag and grazing land, natural areas, wildfire suppression, as we've talked about today, aquatic land management, forest health. And this is an important starting point because essentially all of these areas of operation are places where DNR is affected in one way or another, and in many ways, multiple ways, by climate change and climate impacts. And so in February of this year, DNR as an agency released this climate resilience plan for DNR. The idea was to put together the work that DNR has been going through thus far to clarify both for the agency and the public where we're going with climate resilience. So the purpose of the plan is to advance climate resilience within DNR, and you'll see that at a program specific level as well as an agency-wide level. But the plan was really more than that. Commissioner Franz gave us a charge to look more broadly than just DNR and think about the natural resource sectors within which we work and how we can support climate resilience among our partners throughout the state. And that's tribes, it's cities and counties, stakeholders, other state agencies. And so you'll see that reflected in the report as well. I want to start with definition of climate resilience. DNR uses this definition in the plan: being prepared for and adapting to current and future climate-related changes. And what's interesting about this is when you start thinking about climate resilience for DNR, you come at it from the perspective of lands and waters. What does this mean for lands and waters? So resilience means increasing the health and integrity of the natural systems in order to enhance their ability to absorb and recover from disturbances. But it doesn't end there. It's also very relevant for people and institutions. So as an institution, being resilient means planning for, being prepared for the changes that are coming, so that as there are impacts, we can maintain functions, minimize harm, respond effectively when impacts occur, and recover quickly. I'll also note that from a climate resilience perspective, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is critical so that we prevent further escalation of climate impacts. And so you see reference to that in the plan as well. This is just a brief timeline of how we developed the plan. Components of the process started back in 2014 with the climate risk assessment. In 2018, Commissioner released an updated agency-wide strategic plan that establishes strategic priority, a goal around resilience. In 2018 and 19, we started building on the climate risk assessment by developing and assessing responses, held workshops, developed a climate resilience advisory council. Then in the summer of 2019 was when we really started in earnest to develop this specific plan and reached out to experts and others around the state from tribes, other state agencies, nonprofits, businesses, various sectors that DNR deals with. Also worked with the climate leads for DNR programs, linking together work from across the programs within DNR. And then finally, in February of 2020, we released the document. So let me just go into a little bit more detail about how we put the plan together. Based on the climate risk assessment, we really focused on this question of what are the high priority climate related risks to DNR's mission, responsibilities, and operations. And this is critical because a lot of times when you think about climate change, it can be overwhelming. You think of all the various ways that climate change is going to affect just about everything. But if you focus it down to just what DNR does and why we do it and how climate change affects it, then it can become more manageable. And so the way we did that was we looked at what are our program goals, what do we do, and how does climate change affect that? And that allowed us to identify specific risks to our mission and operations. So the way we identified the risk was this framework. And if you're familiar with risk in general, it's really a function of two items. One is the likelihood that something bad is going to happen, and the second is the consequence if it does. So if it's low likelihood something bad's going to happen, and even if it did, it wouldn't matter that much, then that's great, that's a low risk. If something is almost certain to occur and the consequences are high, then that's a high risk. And so it essentially helps us bin risks by high, medium, and low, and focus on the high risk issues. Phase 2 is about developing responses. And this focuses on that question of how do we continue to fulfill our mission and responsibilities, and also potentially take advantage of opportunities under changing climate conditions. So again, really focusing on what we do as an agency, what we're supposed to do, what we're charged with, and how we do that under changing climate conditions. So I want to give you a sense for how we identified response options. Again, climate change can seem big, but in fact, there's a lot of ways in which we already deal with climate-related issues in our daily jobs. So one example is forest roads and culverts. We know from climate science that there's significant seasonal changes in precipitation that are projected. The warm season dry period is going to get drier. The cold season wet period is expected to be wetter and exhibit heavier downpours. And so in terms of climate risk, this translates to potential increases in conditions that trigger landslides or debris flows and potential forest road damage. So looking at a lot more variability, but we already have some tools in place to plan for variability when we design forest roads and culverts. And so we don't necessarily need to create an additional team of engineers or an additional set of road building equipment, something like that. We may be able to just start by tweaking some of the things that we already do. So for instance, sizing culverts for future flows instead of current flows, prioritizing the high risk drainage structures, or designing roads to accommodate stronger storms, longer dry periods. That said, there may also be areas or situations where the scale of the problem exceeds our ability to address it just by tweaking what we already do, and demands that we need to think about it in a new way. Do we need more activities, more authority, different approaches? And the 2015 wildfire season is an example. Climate risks for wildfire include things like increasing area burned by uncharacteristic fire. I've already talked about that today. The 2015 wildfire season was a time that challenged the militia model within DNR of DNR staff leaving their regular jobs to help fire. And instead of being away for a couple of weeks, folks were out for a month or more. And that challenged both health and safety of those employees, as well as just the workload of what was not getting done within DNR. And so the agency was prompted to think about what are new ways that we need to engage in order to deal with higher variability, more wildfires going on. Do we need more activities, more authority, different approaches? Then finally, there are situations in which the uncertainty around climate change might require that we need to study or learn more. So an example of that is in the aquatics, where DNR has important revenue from geoduck duck leases. We really didn't know how much ocean acidification and other ocean changes would affect geoduck ducks, and so needed to initiate some research to figure that out. And so taken together, these are examples of various ways in which we approach responses, tweaking what we already do, thinking about new things that we need to do, or learning more if necessary. So I'd like to now show you a bit about what is in the resilience plan itself. We start off with a focus on tribal nations, equity, environmental justice, and climate resilience, and also reversing greenhouse gas trends. With tribes, we committed to consultation on next steps, continuous communication as implementation develops. With equity, we are convening an external advisory committee, creating an environmental justice and equity strategy, and also identifying highly impacted communities as we direct our implementation of response options. Specific to the greenhouse gas, reversing greenhouse gas trends, we're committed to 500 megawatts of new solar leases, creating a state agency-wide emissions reduction plan, supporting energy efficiency, and exploring carbon sequestration in a variety of different ways, including harvested wood products and avoided conversion. There's actually a forthcoming report from DNR with recommendations around statewide, from the statewide carbon sequestration advisory group, and that will be forthcoming in December. I'll focus now a bit on the resource-specific climate resilience challenges and opportunities. And here in this part of the table of contents, in this part of the plan, you essentially see a list of what DNR does. So wildfire management, forest management, agriculture, ecosystem conservation, natural areas, aquatics, landslides and geologic survey, and recreation. And each of these sections goes into some specific descriptions of the risks and the responses. Here are some examples of the program-based responses that are in the plan. So for forest management and upland leasing, we have the following: develop climate resilient seed management and reforestation approaches. And Jeff DeBell is going to talk about that in a bit more detail. Addressing forest health and increased wildfire risk on eastern Washington forest lands, and Calvin is going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a bit. Designing and maintaining forest roads to be resilient under current and projected conditions. I mentioned this earlier. We do a lot of road management, and climate change has some significant potential to affect that or damage roads, and so there's a lot going on there. Promote climate suitable strategies for at-risk species, and we're thinking here about salmon as well as marbled murrelet, spotted owl. Developing post-wildfire recovery and restoration strategies, enhancing watershed health, even clean energy and carbon sequestration, as I mentioned earlier. So each of these is basically a headline, and if you look at the document itself, there's a lot more specifics under each of these topics. I'll give you just one more example, just as another example from the plan. This is for natural heritage and natural areas. Again, just emphasizing this is really focusing on what we do. Are there ways to tweak what we do or do different things or learn more and do more research? So for natural areas and natural heritage, assessing the vulnerability and enhancing the monitoring of natural areas, as well as incorporating climate change considerations into site prioritization, selection, and design. So that gives you an example of what's going on for those resource-specific resilience opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit now about agency-level responses. So we've adapted this framework of authority, knowledge, capacity, and motivation for agency-level responses. And this is something that the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington put together, and we've built this out for our own work. So the first is authority. Do we have the authority to incorporate climate resilience into our structures and into our work? And a few things I'll point out here: issuing a commissioner's order, integrating climate change into legal, policy, and guidance documents, and completing program-specific resilience strategies. Just to highlight the first one that I provided on that list, the commissioner's order. So this commissioner's order was released on the same day that the plan for climate resilience was released, and speaks to, so the language that is highlighted here on the slide: DNR will incorporate climate change considerations into all relevant decisions, policies, procedures, and operations, including, where relevant, into legal and policy guidance documents. So the other elements of the authority, knowledge, capacity, and motivation in terms of agency-wide responses, the second is enhancing capacity, and that includes things like embedding climate research into our planning tools, into our budgeting, improving internal coordination. The third is knowledge, incorporating climate resilience into knowledge and learning structures. So a few examples of that might be providing access to climate science, including locally relevant climate data, integrating climate change into staff training or into onboarding. And then the fourth on the list is motivation. And examples of that include developing monitoring or evaluation protocols and program metrics, including climate resilience expectations into job descriptions or into work plans and performance reviews. So that's at the agency-wide level. And for the systems level, statewide systems level, there's also a number of activities that we've identified. And these are things that DNR can't do alone, but the agency needs in order to be effective, need a kind of statewide systemic approach. And so these are recommendations that we've made at the statewide level. One is establishing an interagency climate resilience leadership structure. And the idea here is having an interagency structure that can address risks, address climate responses, support interagency coordination, collaboration, and funding, those sorts of things. The second is providing state-endorsed climate impacts projections to support risk assessment, planning, and regulatory systems. And currently, there's a lot of agencies doing their own thing at the local level, at the state level. There's some disconnect. And so having some way of establishing clarity across the state family, across different agencies would be really valuable. The third, providing mechanisms for funding and financing resilience, essentially making sure we've got the resources to actually address the work that is needed. Fourth is community level resilience planning. Climate impacts really do occur at the local level, and so highlighting that this is a statewide need for support for local jurisdictions and partnership between state and local level is an important aspect. And then finally, education and outreach and engagement on resilience needs and opportunities, making sure that we've got a consistent message, consistent approach to communicating about climate impacts and about climate responses. Okay, so the final part here is near-term implementation steps. And for implementation steps, there are 3 items that are in the plan. Initiate responses that we can implement within DNR's authorities and resources. Second is where we don't have necessary authorities or resources, seek legislative support. And finally, seeking support for statewide systems level climate resilience responses. As we've talked about, there's been a lot that has happened this year. COVID, obviously, as well as other things. And so with budget crisis, there's some disruption of what the implementation plan was originally envisioned. And so we've focused ourselves a bit more here towards the following list, which is initiating actions that we can be implementing with existing resources and authorities. And that's both at the program specific level and at the agency-wide level. We are developing legislative asks for 2021 related to resilience, identifying shovel-ready projects for stimulus funding, should there be stimulus funding that is available. And then finally, the state established a climate resiliency account last year. The funding for that account was vetoed by the governor, but the account itself still exists. And so OFM is still moving forward with that, and we're working to ensure that DNR's priorities are included in the considerations around that account. So that's the end of my presentation. I will just say that there was a question about stakeholder outreach, which I did not specifically speak to in the presentation that I had prepared. I will say that there was outreach to, Matt, I appreciate the question. There was outreach to about 75 individuals around sort of interviews for expert input from academia, from other state agencies, as well as public workshops to gather input from different partners. And there were some business there were some business participants included in that outreach, and would be happy to answer more specific questions about how that outreach occurred if you have them. So that's all I've got for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Board members, obviously I'm just going to start from the context. A lot of people, and I don't think I knew it until I was in this role starting back in 2017, that not a day goes by in this job that we are not on the front lines of a rapidly changing climate, whether it's the context of 2018, where we had the worst flood in Okanagan County since 1973,
the Canadian snow melted so fast it raged through those rivers and passed through the banks and into the blocks of homes and businesses, town after town. And a state of emergency was declared and no one came. I was called, our firefighters were called to come and fill sandbags for weeks to help get that river back at bay. Or the context of the increasing wildfires, which now our wildfire season starts as early as March, not just in eastern Washington, but in fact on the coast, as we saw 53 fires second week of March in 2018 alone. 53 of those on the coast in communities like Wauquiaca, Grace Harbor, Pacific County, Cowlitz. Or the context of our changing forest land, as you have heard from me many, many times, where it's getting hotter, drier, enormous amount of dried out fuel. Our grasslands are changing. We oversee 1 million acres of agricultural land. We're seeing change in the hydrology, increasing droughts. We even saw dust storms a few years back. Or the context of landslides. Many of you may have observed we had huge amount of fires and huge amount of hurricane force winds starting on Labor Day. And then quickly, as cooler temperatures came in, we then had a pretty unprecedented amount of rain, which led to landslides. So not a day goes by that we're not at Department of Natural Resources on the front line of an ever-changing climate that is impacting the responsibilities we have to protect the public, protect our communities, to generate revenues for our beneficiaries. The goal of this plan was to, one, completely understand how our climate is changing, where it's changing, how it's changing on the lands and waters we're responsible for managing, as well as the communities that depend on our lands and waters, not only for environmental and well-being, but also economic being. The goal then was to develop a plan that specifically recognizes the change that are happening today and in the future, and not just focus on the 1 million acres of land that we're responsible for, but because the lands we manage are all 39 counties and represent the totality of lands and waters in Washington State, how do we bring those resources to communities who are on the front lines, frankly, year after year, and sometimes month after month? We've already begun those conversations in a number of the communities that have been really on the front lines of this rapidly changing climate, believing that the investments they need to build their resiliency are the same investments we need to be making for insurance of the resilience of the lands and waters managed, but also for the beneficiaries that receive value from that, as well as the economy of that community. So this plan helps set forward the trajectory we need to be and the direction we need to be going, as well as the conversations and work we need to be doing in the community. So I look forward to a conversation here on it and appreciate your patience for that presentation.
Thank you, Dan and Hillary, for your leadership on this. One thing you may have addressed that I think we want to be attentive to is the intersection between resilience and our efforts to address climate change through mitigation, and prioritizing those actions that provide for both resilience and mitigation. We can't envision the resilience of our resources in our communities separate from the need to address climate change. And I know you did address that, Dan, but we kind of have these two structures. We have a carbon sequestration working group and we have a climate resilience planning process. We just want to be sure that they intersect and interweave as we think about actions that we take.
And Dan, thank you. I mean, this is a constant comment that we have in the work that we do, is not seeing them separate, but in fact, you can see a number of things in the climate resilience plan about carbon sequestration or reducing our carbon footprint, whether it's clean energy or the forest health work to prevent the forest burning down, or the fact that wildfire is our second largest greenhouse gas emissions to transportation in a majority of years, right? And I think the key is we're going to be intersecting those pieces. I'm very excited about the Carbon Sequestration Advisory Group, which Dan also helps lead up. So you can see the work of the team is also aligned So thank you for that comment. Other board members, questions?
This is Bill Peach.
Yeah.
What I appreciate about this approach is that it's built on what we know and fundamental forestry, such as genetics and seed source. And that contrasts with other plans, because I've seen other plans identify the final outcome, and then they back toward how they will execute and discover that there are steps or activities that they really don't control or don't have the ability to influence. What's very appealing to me, and I've shared this broadly in the industry, is that this approach begins with what we know, begins with what we can control, and then opens the door to additional research. So I really appreciate the document and the approach that's being taken. Thanks.
Thank you, board members. Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say I appreciate the work that DNR has done here. As Dan said, the OFM is working on this climate resiliency proviso that was put in the budget by the legislature. And, you know, this work done by DNR is very helpful and kind of helping to lead the state efforts in looking at resiliency. So I think there's some good things here. One question I do have is and maybe Dan can talk or we can talk about it later, is just kind of the implementation and accountability for implementing the parts of this plan and identifying, you know, where we're making progress and where we're not. I think that's, you know, that's what we're going to need to keep track of as we move forward in future years and make budget and legislative requests. So any update on that would be appreciated.
And I'll just say one, yeah, I'll go and then, so obviously this is a huge body, and let me, what is behind it that is not seen in today's presentation is an enormous amount of science and research, right? That is not at the 40,000 foot level, but it's really at the landscape level, and similar to work we've done sort of in the forest health work. Our goal is to be moving forward at a number of levels, measurable targets to be moving forward, operational targets, so that within our planning, our processes, our decision making, climate and changing climate and creating more resilient lands, waters, and communities is part of that. So we are building out that project timeline of that work. Some of the work, obviously, as you can imagine, does call for significant investments. You know, when we're talking about water resources and we're talking about drought conditions and needing to address that issue, not only does it not pertain just to our agency, but multiple agencies, as you know, Jim, but it also means pretty significant investments in infrastructure, similar to what we have seen in the context of wildfire and even in forest health. But we will be developing sort of a very much clearer project and prioritization, as well as timeline, but also a pretty clear statement of what the investment resources funding will need to be. Go ahead, Angus.
So, well, following on from the new commissioner, and I want to thank you, Mr. Kale, for asking the question, because it's a great segue into the next two presentations, which actually relate to some of the actions that we're actually taking right now. And as I say, in future presentations, we'll provide you a little bit more detail about actually how we're implementing some of the rest of the plan. So if I might suggest that we could let Calvin and Jeff present a little bit more detail in two specific areas, one being the forest health and how that relates to our resilience strategy, as well as the work we're doing in related to forest genetics. I'll let you go, Calvin.
Okay, You guys hear me okay? All right. So my name's Calvin Olson-Keen. I'm an assistant division manager for forest resources. I'm responsible for our silviculture and reforestation program. Today, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of how we're managing our forested trust lands to promote forest health and resilience to climate change. You're going to hear that phrase a lot, forest health and resilience, and as you may be aware, we have a division that does that work they're the leaders of our 20-year plan that is designed to restore forest health in Eastern Washington. As the commissioner mentioned earlier, we are collaborating closely with them on state lands. I'm going to stay at a very high level, but I could certainly provide more information in future presentations. So DNR's climate resilience plan lists multiple climate-related risks to DNR's forest sector responsibilities. You've already heard about these, so from probably both Commissioner Franz and Dan, but there are the risks of increased wildfire potential that we're already seeing, increased damage from insects and pathogens, and in addition, potential seed and reforestation challenges. My presentation will focus on some of the strategies to address these impacts. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on our east side forests. However, we are doing quite a bit of work in Western Washington as well. In the climate plan, state trust lands committed to 5 priority responses to develop climate resilient seed management and reforestation approaches. Jeff DeBell, our forest geneticist, will cover most of these in his in the next talk. I will briefly touch on a couple. Increasing our seed storage capacity. We have a sub-zero seed freezer that has seed going back that's been collected as far back as 50 years. It's currently full. We have a capital request that's going before the legislature to design a new seed center. This would considerably increase our seed processing and storage capacity. That would in turn enable us to invest more in our woods run cone collections, and it would enhance our ability to build up seed reserves for genetic conservation and recovery efforts in the event of major forest disturbances. The second area is we are studying natural regeneration following wildfire. As Commissioner Franz has mentioned, we've seen the extensive wildfire impacts increase in recent years, and there's growing concern that forest landowners can't keep up with the need to replant these acres. For example, in 2014 and 2015, it's estimated that over 10% of our forested trust lands in just our northeast region were burned. So we're looking at how well these burned lands are regenerating naturally. We're also doing trials on hand planting and active reforestation approaches. These are 3 priority responses to address forest health issues in Eastern Washington forests. These reinforce elements of what we've been doing on DNR trust lands for the last 20 years. As temperatures have increased, moistures in the soil have decreased, and increasing wildfire and other disturbances combine, we're seeing increased stresses on our east side forests. We expect this to continue, and risks of mortality are likely to increase, and the financial returns on east side forests could further erode. So to address these things, some of our priority responses are to apply uneven aged management with natural regeneration on economically marginal east side lands. This enables to minimize regeneration expenses in areas where there just isn't a lot of return on investment. Where ecologically appropriate, we are continuing to promote more drought, disease, and fire resilient species. We could do this through thinning species that are less resilient and then replanting with species that are more resilient. We're also using funding mechanisms such as the Forest Health Revolving Fund to facilitate stand density and fuel reduction treatments that can't be covered under our standard management funding model. I added a fourth one here that isn't actually in the climate resilience plan, but it is a critical element of how we maintaining stands at lower density to reduce stress is inherent in everything we do in managing Eastern Washington forests. In 2017, the agency completed its 20-year plan to restore forest health in Eastern Washington. The plan addresses all landowners, federal, state, tribal, and private. To complement this plan, we completed our state land strategy in early 2018. A few components of the strategy include managing for trust benefit, which means realizing current value and creating future value, managing stands to reduce risk of disturbance and loss, investing appropriately based on site productivity. And we really, as you guys know and have heard in previous presentations, that it's economically challenging to manage many of our low value stands that are at the greatest risk. So we're looking for ways to be efficient so that we can maximize the extent of the treatments that we're doing and minimize our reliance on Washington taxpayers to the extent that we can. And of course, we are always in this for the long term. So this is kind of just one way to look at the variability of Eastern Washington forests. The variability is based on a variety of factors, temperature, precipitation, and the result. This is a model of the water availability in the soil, which is probably the primary determining factor in the composition of forests. This is a map of vegetation ecotypes, and we created 6 ecotypes for grouping Eastern Washington forests. As you might imagine, it should be no surprise that different forest types require different management strategies. But as I said before, we are always trying to promote more drought, disease, and fire resilient species and maintain stands at lower density to reduce stress. As we've shared in previous presentations to the board, in 2017, the legislature directed DNR state lands to conduct a prioritization of where to conduct forest health treatments. The legislative intent was to reduce wildfire hazards and losses, reduce insects, disease, and improve health and resilience at the landscape scale. And that prioritization, we conducted our first one in 2018, was based on the value of our timber and other commercial forest products, risks to infrastructure, recreation, tourism, and ecosystem services. We are currently in the final throes of completing our next legislative report, which will be available to the legislature in November. On state lands, we've treated around 250,000 acres in the last 10 years. I should note that these acres presented here are total treatment acres. In some cases, we're doing multiple activities within the same area. For example, following a timber harvest, we will often conduct a site preparation and replanting, which means that the footprint of the acres we're treating is less than the 26,000 acres a year that I'm showing here. Right now, we're collaborating with our Forest Health and Resiliency Division on ways to more accurately track and be consistent on how we're reporting on the footprint of our treatments. As Commissioner Franz mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, she's asking us to look at how we can accelerate our work given what we've been seeing in the last month. Although the state lands forest health treatment prioritization wasn't completed until fall of 2018, you could see in this figure that 3/4 of our treatments have been conducted in high or medium priority landscapes. This is in line with what we want to accomplish going forward. And this is my last note. There have also been there was a comment about science and research. We have research going on a lot of fronts and have in fact received over $1 million in the last 3 years in grants to support our work on climate, studying forests and their responses to climate impacts. Just quick mention, since 2015, we've been studying post-wildfire natural regeneration in Eastern Washington. The good news is we are getting a lot of natural regeneration, and the need for active reforestation is less than may have been previously thought, although we're not always getting the species and the distribution that we'd like to see. We're also studying efforts that we can do to enhance regeneration in places where there is no seed source following extreme fires. And we're looking at climate change, wildfire, and vegetation research. We've got a couple, and we're publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and our scientists are at the forefront of this work. Any questions?
Board members, any questions?
Yeah, one quick question. Could you go back to the, not the last slide, but the slide before about treatment?
This one?
Yep, thank you. So I really appreciate this, information. I think it's really helpful to understand where we're making progress and where we're not. But when I look at this, it looks like your distribution is basically equal, more or less, between high, medium, and low priority landscapes. I guess the question is, why aren't we focusing more on high priority landscapes? Or how do we focus more on high priority landscapes since we've been doing this for 9 years in order to improve forest health in these areas at greatest risk?
That's a great question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, Calvin, don't worry. So, Jim, we are absolutely focused on high priority. If you look at this 2011 to 2020, first our forest health plan was completed at the end of 2017. The mapping of the high priority areas started in early 2018, right? So we have now officially 2 years. And one of the great things of the forest health science team is that we were targeted to complete about 200,000 acres of assessment on federal, state, private, and tribal land by this year. And Calvin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we calculated 2 million acres worth of assessment and development of treatments need to happen on those landscapes. So we've blown past that. The great thing about that is it now sets us up in those 33 priority areas that have been identified in our forest health plan to heavily target them and invest in them. And so we're at the beginning really of that. 1, we did the prioritization. 2, we did the assessment on all the prioritization areas. Now we are fully investing our resources and time and energy in those high priority areas. So Calvin, I want you to explain a little more in depth too.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, you got most of it. The primary thing I would add is that in addition, I mean, we still have our trust land responsibilities, right? So we are actively managing all of our trust lands to the extent that we can. And I should also note that these low priority landscapes have high priority parcels and stands within them that may be at high risk. And so we are never going to go to zero in these landscapes. We do, of course, want to accelerate our work in the high and medium landscapes to the extent possible, but we're going to be working everywhere, and that's in accordance with our trust responsibilities.
And I just want to identify, and I think Ray, the big fire is sort of a great example, and Calvin, you can jump in. The big Paula fire is the one that started down in the Skamania area, and it started on federal land, very difficult land to access, not only for firefighting, but also for forest health treatment. We were on that fire with the feds because threatened and obviously did eventually touch our land. And we are very much making sure that we are not just focused on the treatments on state lands. Obviously, it's paramount in the context of our fiduciary responsibilities, but because so much of our federal lands, over 40% of our federal lands, or 40% of just the central and eastern Washington, 1.25 million acres that need to be treated, there is federal lands that is the problem. We have got to be on top of those, and those, every one of those fall in priority landscapes. And then we have oftentimes state trust lands adjacent to it. They may not be defined as high priority based on the forest, but still we're able to get more effectively in and treat ours at the same as we're doing the federal lands.
Yeah, and that, yeah, no, then that's a great example because we are collaborating closely with the Forest Service and other landowners. There are sometimes areas where we may need access through the Forest Service, and if their roads, you know, for example, if their roads aren't maintained currently in a standard that we can use to remove commercial products, we're trying to work with them to target those areas at the same time. And so as they're able to get in, that enables our ability to do so. I should also mention that big hollow fire in Western Washington burned several hundred acres of our young managed stands. And so we've worked with the Pacific Cascade region. They've already ordered seedlings through my program. The seed is already being pulled out from our freezer. It's going into stratification, and we're going to be sowing in the spring to reforest those areas that were burned. It'll take a couple of years to grow those seedlings, but.
Board members, any other comments, questions on this? Thank you, Calvin.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, we have one more presentation on this, which is Jeff DeBell. Hopefully Jeff's there and he can give a presentation around what's going on in the Forest Genetics program.
Yep, I'm here. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So my name is Jeff DeBell, and I'm DNR's forest geneticist. I'm responsible for genetic testing and seed production, which is one part of our overall reforestation program. The other parts are seed collection in the woods, seedling production in the nursery, and planting in the regions. I'll zoom in a little closer and connect to some of the broader ideas that you heard from Calvin to some specific program level actions that we've been taking to address climate change. I'll start with a couple of slides to illustrate what we're concerned about before describing what we're doing in response. So those of you who are gardeners will be familiar with the old adage, right plant, right place. And that's the essence of what we try to do. Trees, even of the same species, are genetically different as you move across the state. They're adapted to the growing conditions in their area. So we need to pay attention to seed source when we're planting trees. So the map on this slide shows kind of how we do that. The state's divided into smaller areas that we call seed zones. And the idea is if you plant trees back to the same area where the seed was collected, then the trees will be properly adapted. So matching seed source to environment is really nothing new. What is new is with climate change is that we expect the growing environment to shift over the life of the tree. So the challenge then is to decide which environment to match when we're choosing seed source. One thing that I find useful is shifting from thinking about planting sites in geographic space to thinking about them in climate space. So let me explain this graphic that you see. Temperature increases from left to right. Rainfall increases from top to bottom. So the upper right-hand corner is warm and dry, while the lower left-hand corner is cool and wet. The green blocks are combinations of temperature and moisture where DNR owns forest land. And this is just for Western Washington lands in this particular graphic. The darker the shade of the green, the more acres we have in that climate combination. Sorry about that. So the blocks outlined in black might represent planting sites. So we're accustomed to changing seed source as we move from one planting site to another. We're not accustomed to the entire green area shifting as the tree is growing. So one way to think about this is that climate change has the effect of picking up a planting spot and dropping it in another place on this map. So now I'll shift from what we're concerned about to some concrete things that we're doing. This slide lists examples of projects where we're not the lead organization, but we're supporting the work because we think it will help provide information that we need to make operational decisions. Our support could take the form of funding, providing test sites, sharing supplies, or even helping with data analysis. The first on the list is a U.S. Forest Service-led study that I consider to be one of the most important being done. The dots on this map represent Douglas fir seed sources from all along the West Coast. These seed sources are planted at 9 sites in Oregon and Washington that represent a wide range of environments. There are 2 reasons that I consider this study particularly important. One is it gives us real data on how trees are actually growing across these environments, not just predictions from computer models. And the second is that it helps us understand the risks of adapting too slowly as well as the risks of adapting too quickly. In our operations, getting it wrong on either side can lead to similar problems with forest health and productivity. The second item is led by Bureau of Land Management down in Oregon and involves planting seed sources in warm and dry environments to assess drought tolerance. We've provided some DNR seed sources for this study, and initial results show that our DNR seed sources are performing very well, despite being moved much further south to fairly challenging sites. And then the last 2 items are supported through our membership in one of the research cooperatives. The seed lot selection tool is a computer program that combines GIS with climate model output to help us understand where we might look for seed sources better adapted to future climates. Then in the same cooperative, work is being done to develop DNA markers that may help us in the future to screen trees for important traits like drought hardiness. So this slide now moves to projects where we have more of an active role. Now we still typically do this work in cooperation with others just because it's more cost effective. A very significant effort that we have going is the testing and evaluation of Douglas fir seed sources. This is done in cooperation with most of the large forest landowners in Western Washington. The costs are shared among all parties, but DNR is the lead for executing the work, from planting to maintenance to measurement. We test many potential seed parents on sites throughout Western Washington, representing many different environments. We use this information to decide which trees to use as seed parents in our seed orchard. Because this testing program has been going on for decades, it can help us make adjustments over time as the climate shifts. And that's because each time we begin a new round of tests, the trees are being evaluated in the most current conditions. And then in addition to growth, these tests allow us to screen for adaptive traits like cold and drought tolerance. And you may wonder why we'd care about cold tolerance related to climate change, but sometimes when plants are grown in a warmer environment than they're adapted to, they break bud too early in the spring, and the effect of the warmer environment is actually cold damage. And that's what you see in this photo here. In addition to some of our mainstream seed source testing, we're also preparing to install some tests with a much wider range of seed sources, sort of a more operational extension of that seed source movement trial I mentioned, putting it on more sites. This work is intended to help guide seed source changes that may be more significant than the adjustments we can make using the trees in our current testing program. So with this slide, I'm going to shift from where we're collecting data to actually some of the operational things that we're doing to adapt. So one thing we've done is DNR recently revamped our large database that's called LRM that we use to keep track of stands and the management activities that occur in them. Part of that system is making seed source choices for our planting program. And we've designed the system to make it very easy to adjust our seed source choices without needing to make any structural changes to the system. The second bullet is a few years back, we established a ponderosa pine seed orchard for Western Washington. This is based on the native population that's found primarily on joint-based Lewis McCord. And some landowners are already planting ponderosa on droughty Western Washington sites, and this orchard will allow them to do that with seed native to the area. Next bullet down, we're including wood stiffness in our criteria for choosing seed orchard parents. while this isn't related to climate change in terms of tree health, it does intersect with carbon sequestration strategies and wood markets. And it's just a reminder that we're not only preparing for changes in the physical environment, but also for other changes that were probably coming in the future. The market for engineered wood products, including cross-laminated timber, may provide the potential for enhanced revenue for trust beneficiaries if more of our wood meets certain quality specifications. And then finally, as we choose trees for our seed orchard, we're picking trees that seem to perform well over a wide range of environments. They may not be the very best at any particular site, but they hold up well wherever they're planted. And our hope is that the stability of performance across current environments indicates that they'll be more robust to a changing environment in the future. And I'll just leave you with this photo, which is, these are branch tips from the very same seed source, but grown on two different sites. And it's just a nice visual example of how growing environment has such a big effect on tree growth and appearance. And with that, I'm done unless there's any questions.
Board members, questions, comments?
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Calvin. So, board members, if we can transition, we'll transition to the presentation on legislative.
Angus,
Yep.
you might, if I don't, I'm gonna sort of just sort of set the stage just so board members are aware, and this may be a repetition for some, but so the next piece we're going to be presenting the legislative priorities, and a lot of work has gone into conversations and discussions with legislators around the state. In fact, within just a few weeks after session, we began having myself and our team having multiple conversations every single week with legislators throughout the state and every corner of the state. Much of it was around recognizing the impacts that COVID is having on our budget. You know, at the time it looked very dire. It's still dire, but it's certainly not as dire as it originally was. And I know Jim's feeling a little bit of relief, maybe just a tad, given it's still pretty significant impacts. And a lot of conversation with legislators around the impacts of COVID on the economy, around revenues at the state level, around where the top priorities will be. All of those conversations were around the critical reality of jobs and importance for economic development and creating more stability, while also recognizing there's very limited resources and revenue that will be available. We also then did virtual tours with, ideally we were going to do them in person with legislators. In every region of our state, we did virtual tours with inviting legislators from around the state to participate in each and every one of them. We had significant participation engagement in that. You can find those materials online too. All of that work in the conversations, communications that we have had with our legislators leads us to the prioritization and list of priorities that you'll see here. I'd say with the one addition, and which is that obviously what happened on Labor Day and the weeks that followed raised the profile and the importance of the issue around wildfire protection resources, forest health and restoring the health of our forests and our landscapes, and as I stated earlier, community resilience and making investments in our communities to protect them from these catastrophic wildfires. You will not hear much today about the scope and scale of legislation we will be putting forward and an ask similar to other years before. It will look different. Our goal is to make sure that we come out of the next session with a dedicated revenue, a source of dedicated revenue for wildfire protection, for forest resiliency, for both sides, east and west, as well as we dive in right now today, just because I think it will be for a future conversation in the next month or two, where we can spend an enormous amount of time on that. I'm gonna, with that, kick it over to Angus, who's gonna walk through those legislative priorities, and I look forward to the conversation with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I'm just going to ask, Dwayne, are you presenting or am I going to be passing this to Brock?
I'm going to be presenting.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm gonna let you get up the presentation, and I'll let you, Dwayne, I'll hand this off to you, and then Brock, and then I'll wrap this up at the end.
Sounds good. And so I think you can all see my presentation now. And as the commissioner mentioned, we're going to be talking about the legislative priorities for the department. Some of the first slides will be the entire agency's priorities, but then we will be talking about the state land priorities specifically. So again, as the commissioner mentioned, post-COVID recovery, job creation, community resilience, agency efficiencies, and then salmon recovery and climate resilience are the focus. And then also, again, that big push on wildfire and forest health and forest resilience. So this slide shows you all of the different legislative priorities for the entire agency. I won't go into all of these in detail, but in general, under the different programs, geologic survey, a lot of work on aggregate resource mapping, carbon sequestration, kind of that deep carbon sequestration, and then also geothermal energy, looking at mapping those resources around the state. And then also the school seismic work that I think was mentioned earlier. In the aquatics program, derelict vessel removal, that's a very important one that has been ongoing for a number of years. And then the Snohomish watershed restoration, that's the priority watershed the agency and others are working on. And so there'll be an ask related to the work that is going on in that priority watershed. The uplands asks, we'll go through in a lot more detail. Forest practices, continued ask for the Family Forest Fish Passage Program, aerial herbicide application. That was a big interest in the last legislative session. There is also a component of that on state trust lands that Calvin and the silviculture group will be working on. Forest Practices Online is a system to get forest practices applications online so that folks don't have to come into region offices, fill out that paperwork or turn in that paperwork during this time of COVID. Again, I won't read through, I guess, all of these in the interest of time. Forest health and wildfire. I will note that the state lands component of our forest health and wildfire ask is contained within this. We'll talk about it in more detail, but we generally don't make two separate asks for forest health funding. We don't want to be competing against ourselves as we're bringing those or get confusion in the legislature. So that's always wrapped into the one larger forest health and wildfire ask. In general, the geologic survey is about 3.1 million in capital and operating asks. Aquatics is just under 8 million. State uplands, ours will be about 54 million. And then forest practices is about 31 million. And the forest health and wildfire, again, this number is changing and, as we're continuing to do work on that, but it currently stands at about 35 million in capital and then some operating asks. So now on to some of the legislative priorities for state uplands. Some of these are legislative asks, so changes in RCW. Others are capital or operating asks. So the first one, commercial real estate. This is a legislative ask. This is a small change to an RCW that only pertains to state trust lands. And that is, and we've talked about it before, that the current RCW allows us to lease for commercial and other long-term leases for a maximum of 55 years. That's generally below what private industry does, and is even lower than what port districts and other government organizations are able to lease for. So we're looking to simply change that one word or one number from 55 to 99 years. And so as we are looking to do ground leases, developers, they need a longer term in order to acquire funding, get that bank funding. So they need to show that they have control of that land for longer than the 55 years. Some of the things we run into are, as a project is being developed in stages, by the time they've gone about 10 years, now they're only at 40 years. And then another 5, now they're only at 35 years, and they just can't get funding. And we can't renew or bump the lease term out because that lease term is for the maximum of 55. So a small change that only affects the department. Rural broadband, this is a capital ask of $2 million. This is one we've been working closely with Department of Commerce and their rural broadband office. We've been having conversations with the superintendent's office and participating on a weekly IACT Internet Action Team meeting that's been hosted by Representative Gregerson, talking about rural broadband. We have lands in every county in the state, and a lot of those lands are those rural lands. That's where the greatest need for connectivity is. I mean, the need is everywhere. We have, I have coworkers, I haven't seen their face in 9 months because they're just outside of Olympia, but they can't turn on their camera because their broadband is too low. And so this asks, we're a small piece of the puzzle, but where our lands are and where they intersect that need, we're trying to emphasize development. So this is an ask to upgrade existing sites. We have over 100 communication sites around the state. This also is an ask to help us investigate and to expand into new areas. So areas where we may not have easement, it'll allow us to acquire those easements, allow us to put in infrastructure, power, or what have you. So this is, again, it's a small piece of that larger need, but it's in some cases a critical part. Early on during the COVID pandemic, we were reached out to by the Ho tribe because they had no connectivity. We were able to just quickly turn around and get them a land use license so they could bring their cooperators up to look at some of the sites that we had, and then quickly turned around the ability for them to start getting connected. And that's the kind of thing that we need to do throughout the state. The next is improving road access. This is another ask for, this is actually a small change, again, to an RCW. The department is required in certain instances to grant easement across our land, either a road use permit or a road easement. And that's for traditional valuable material extraction, so timber haul for rock haul and those types of things. So private landowners that need to cross our lands in order to carry out those activities. We run into a problem when we've granted access or acquired an easement and exchanged an easement with the Forest Service. When we grant them access across our lands, those roads typically become part of the National Forest Road Network. And so they then have road control and third-party granting rights for those roads. So in those areas, we no longer control that segment of road. So we don't have the ability to grant access. The RCW says we shall grant access. The Forest Service has the same requirement to grant access for the same purposes. So what our attorneys have said is that we have risk when we're exchanging an easement with the Forest Service or granting them an easement. We have risk that then we have to grant access, but we've given up that. ability to. So for more than a decade, we've been stalled on actually exchanging easements or cooperating with the Forest Service on getting and granting easements. So we've been resorting to just exchanging road use permits. We buy a permit and we haul our timber and we do our activities instead of cooperating fully on some of those road sections. So this is a small change to an RCW that just says that, you know, DNR shall still do all of this, except when road control has been granted to the federal government. So that gets us out of that legal bind, because a worst case scenario is we would have to grant access parallel to an existing road if somebody just said, I don't want to get a permit from the Forest Service. I want to get it just from you. So we want to try and just remove that bit of legal risk by changing a little phrase in that RCW. Again, only one that applies to the department. Timber sale process improvements, that's another legislative, I guess, a suite of small fixes. We have certain RCWs, for example, that require us to hold our timber sale auctions in the region office or on lands designated by the county commissioners for the lands that timber sale is occurring on. As we all know, during COVID, we've had to shut down our region offices. We're holding those auctions remotely, but we are still having folks bring their bid deposits and bring their bids to the region office, et cetera. The one instance in the first days of the pandemic, the auction was occurring on that Wednesday. That Wednesday, we had to shut down the region office because of a positive COVID hit. And so we had to close the entire office, the bid box, somebody had to grab it and lock it in the office. And then we had to wait a week for the office to be cleaned in order to go back in and get those bids. So we want to change an RCW that requires us to do it at the region office and change it to say at a location designated by the agency. Other RCWs, when certain RCWs were recodified in 2003, they now point to RCWs that no longer exist. So there were some that were missed in that recodification. And then there are requirements for us to auction our timber when we have a no bid and we need to change the price. We're required to advertise for another 28 days in order to, before we can bring it back for public auction. We want to change that so that we don't have to advertise again for the full 28 days. Our purchasers have seen it. They've decided at that price they didn't want to get on board. We'd like to be able to change the price and then bring it back sooner if possible. And so certain, just again, changes to how we advertise and how we conduct the auctions on our timber sales. Another, professional realtor services. This is another RCW that pertains to our land transactions. Currently, we have to take transactions to public auction and fail. Then we can use professional realtor services, and we would bring those to the board and say we want to use a professional realtor to help us with some of these complex transactions. What we would like is to remove that requirement that we fail first, bring these to the board and say, board, we have a complex transaction we would like to use professional realtor services for. Then with your authority, we could do that without having to go through that first step of failing. So again, a small change to an RCW that only applies to the department. Survey monument preservation. The agency is also the Public Land Survey Office, or that's one of the roles the agency has. One of the things that that office does is preserves survey monuments around the state. What this will do is change the funding of that office. Currently, they retain a recording fee for all land surveys. This would eliminate that and increase the recording fee on all documents that come through that office by $10. And that would then fund grants basically for counties, for cities to replace damaged, lost survey monuments. As anyone who works in land management knows, if you don't know where your corners are, you don't know where your land is, you can't do development, you can't put in roads, you can't put in highways, any of that kind of thing. So this is an important one, and it's not an unfunded mandate, but it's a severely underfunded mandate that the state preserve these monuments. So a small change in a fee will provide the funding for the state to do that work. Roads and bridges, this one is a capital ask of 7.4 million. This combines a couple of different types of work that we do out on our roads. We have our traditional RMAPs work, our road maintenance and abandonment plans, repairing or replacing fish passage culverts. Part of that is through the Bolt decision. There are certain culverts, injunction culverts as we call them, that must be replaced in order to satisfy that lawsuit. We're getting to the tail end of that work. But now all of those culverts that we've been replacing over the last couple of decades, some of those are now in need of replacement. So there's replacement of those older existing fish culverts, but then also bridges that were put in place of those fish passages that need repair or replacement. So a total cost of about 7.4 million. And the next state forest land replacement, this is a cost of 6 million. This is those 3 counties in Southwest Washington that have lands encumbered by endangered species, Skamania, Wahkiakum, and Pacific counties. This $6 million funds replacement lands. So the department identifies those areas that are encumbered. We find suitable replacement land, and what we do first is buy out basically that trust land, put it into natural area, natural resource conservation area. The county gets the value of the timber, and there's the money to then buy replacement forest land. Next one is silviculture. This is an ask of 2.7 million in capital funding to do silviculture work primarily on the west side. So this is pre-commercial thinning, vegetation management, site preparation, and some reforestation on our lands on the west side. As we've talked about in the past, as Angus has talked about a number of times, our timber prices have not really changed over the last few decades. The costs to manage these lands have gone up. And as we've faced budget problems in the past, silviculture is usually one of the first things that we have to forego. So we have quite a backlog in pre-commercial tinning, in that young stand management. So this will not only produce jobs in the near term, it will increase that growth and then increase that revenue on those stands. So this one is, again, a capital ask to fund that silviculture work here on the west side. The next one, nature, $2 million. Not an exciting ask, but a critical one. The nature system is our contracts and revenue system for the agency. So all of our revenue generating contracts through all of the programs, not just on state uplands, but our aquatic lands, geology division, and even our forest health and resilience division, all of those good neighbor authority contracts are managed through the nature system. All of the finances, all of the revenue for the agency are run through the system. When the One Washington system, which is a statewide computer system that will be taking over the financial components, the HR components, and some other components of statewide financing, When that comes online, this system will cease to work, because this system marries the financial and then those contracting and leasing components. It's basically ripping the brain out of the system. And so we will not be able to manage our leases, our contracts, our rights of ways, any of our revenue generating contracts when that system goes online. But we need to do the work now to replace that system. And again, this is an agency-wide system. It's not just state uplands. It's all of the programs use this system to manage those revenue contracts, those long-term permits and things like that. The last for me, before I turn it over to Brock, is our state trust land forest health treatments. This is $4.3 million, and this builds on existing work that we've been doing. As you know, we have a forest health revolving fund that we use to do work in Eastern Washington. So timber sales and other activities that generate revenue, we retain that funding and then can put it into non-commercial work. But that fund still is not at a state where we can give up seeking capital funding altogether. So 4.3 million to do those non-commercial treatments, pre-commercial thinning, reforestation, those types of things on state trust lands throughout the east side. So I'll pause and see if there are any questions on this before we turn it over to Brock to go through more of the other asks.
Board members, that was a lot. You have any questions, comments, thoughts? Thank you, Dwayne. Yes, Dean Wright.
Dwayne, thank you very much for your presentation. We are seeing firsthand the effect of broadband service with our students being able to take their classes online, but even with our faculty being able to teach those classes effectively. And we've been giving out hotspots to both faculty, staff, and students to try to help that. Can you just clarify for me that the $2 million, is that to upgrade existing broadband sites, or does that also include providing equipment at new sites?
So that ask will do a number of things. It will repair existing sites or do maintenance on existing sites, not specific to just broadband. So the sites that we have the tower and we own the tower and the equipment, you know, it may have a TV antenna on it. It may have cellular from Verizon, but then it'll also have, you know, local broadband company all on the same, co-located on the same tower, and then the equipment housed in the same building. So some of this is to do maintenance on those existing buildings, put in new roofs, things like that. But then also do tower studies so that we can say whether a tower is at capacity or not. And if it's at capacity, then we can look at putting in a new tower. So some of these are adding new towers to sites. The Paradise site in Eastern Washington, we had contact by the Inland Broadband Company a couple of weeks ago about increasing capacity there, adding towers in Clallam County. Then there's also exploring new sites. So those areas where, like I said, we may not have any comm sites, but where there's a need, and then there's a company that's looking to do to establish something there. In some of these areas, the small town or hamlet of Acme up in our Northwest region, we had contact from a small broadband company that had been working with the Bellingham School District, been working with the Port District and, you know, local legislators, trying to get service to the 30 or 40 homes in Acme. This would allow us, the site was at full capacity. It's actually a ground lease, so they would work with the lessee of that site, but that site was at capacity, and so we couldn't expand that site. this would allow us to, spend the money to put up a tower, to expand the site, to allow them to then, lease. They can't afford to put up a $600,000 tower and then put up their equipment and then provide service to 30 homes. It doesn't pencil out. That's why a lot of these rural areas don't have service, because it doesn't pencil out. This one, yes, the taxpayers would provide that funding. The revenue would go back to generally the common school fund, and then those students or those homes will start getting connected. So it's not the broadband as a utility, but it is a, that economic hurdle has to be overcome. And again, we've been working with the broadband office. The state is not eligible for any of those broadband grants through the broadband office. And so this is the reason for the capital ask.
Thank you.
One comment, Dwayne, thank you for your presentation. Just to, and you're probably already thinking about this, but you got a number of bills here related to state land management. And given what may or may not happen during the session about how they're going to meet or not meet, or the number of bills they'll be able to process, you might want to consider consolidating many of these proposals into one bill as opposed to running 3 or 4 different ones, just to make it an easier process.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's actually, I appreciate, that's actually much of the conversation we've been having. We broke it out here so everybody sees it in the context of individuals, so it's not sometimes in a context where the sausage making is just not pretty even by the outcome versus the input. So this way you guys have it all sort of clearly laid out what we're thinking about and break it up, but absolutely. And appreciate also your insight given it is going to be a challenging session, not only because of funding and revenue resources, but also because everybody's going to have to learn how to do this a little bit differently.
Yeah, no,
hopefully public comments, hopefully comments will be a lot easier than some of the challenges that we've had.
All right, if there aren't other questions, I will turn it over to Brock to carry on.
Great. Thanks, Dwayne. That was quite thorough. I'll try and make it through this pretty quick if I can. So I'm going to just be talking about a few more legislative requests that we have. And the first one I'm going to start with is the Puget Sound Corps. The Puget Sound Corps started as kind of a cooperative or in addition to some of the work that Ecology was doing back during the Great Recession. And we've been able to move that into this stable and permanent program. It does so many different things in, things like working on our aquatic reserves. Many of those members go out and work in our fire camps during the summertime. They build or they rebuild bridges that are falling down on trails. They do so many things, but in addition to that, it employs a group of people that is largely underemployed, and particularly underemployed when we have recessions or economic challenges like we're having right now. So this program focuses on 18 to 25-year-olds. It provides them a paycheck as well as a stipend for schooling. And you can judge this how you want, but as a 24-year-old back in 2004 who was having a hard time getting my career started during the dot-com bust, I turned to WCC and became a WCC crew member and then a crew supervisor. And this is basically the same program, but run in cooperation with Ecology. The next one I want to talk about is recreational immunity for target shooting. The department has been working pretty diligently on providing some spots and working on the best ways to provide target shooting. But we have found that a minor tweak in the rec immunity language would provide better protection for the agency. And so that's all that's about. Go ahead, next slide, Dwayne. I'm going to cover sustainable rec and natural areas facilities preservation together. So these two programs provide funding for us to build new trail, restore old bridges that are falling apart or campgrounds, and to provide public access, predominantly providing access and doing some major restoration work. The sustainable rec piece of it is on our trust lands, and the natural areas facilities preservation is on our natural area preserves and natural resource conservation areas. I will say during the COVID shutdown, once we were able to reopen, found, and as I'm sure many of you have, that people have turned to the lands when many other things were not available to them. They came out in almost unbelievable numbers to experience the lands. We were having a lot of staff sharing stories with us about bumping into people who said, well, I've lived up the road, but I've never actually come here before. And they went and bought their Discover Pass for the first time, and they were coming out on the lands, and we were just seeing unbelievable numbers. We know we can provide so much more. A lot of our infrastructure is aging, and so both of these are really about that. Additionally, the other thing I want to say is the department did work with the Recreation and Conservation Office, I almost said last year, but that was just earlier this year, to update the 2015 economic study on recreation, and kind of not too much to our surprise, found that the numbers continue to go up. The value of the recreation economy in Washington is exceeding now $26 billion a year. And a lot of that happens on DNR managed lands, and we're trying to find places for people to go and to experience our lands in a sustainable way. Next, this is a smaller one, but I want to highlight it just a bit. We have 96 natural areas across the state, some of which do not have any staff at all because we don't, we're unable to provide that with the funding that we receive. So for instance, the Olympic region does not have any staff to look after the, I believe it's 13 natural areas that are in the Olympic region. When we are able to increase our M&O through, and we're able to do this, you know, we work with OFM to show what sorts of acquisitions we've made over time. We're able to bring more staff into this program that is heavily understaffed. Next slide. So Richland 16, we'll hit on this one real fast. Richland 16 is a property in Richland that is transitioning. It's been a great orchard, and we've had a great partner there for, I'm not sure how many years, but for quite a long time. It was recently rezoned, and it's multi-zoned for, you know, some of it is open space, some of it was high density residential, commercial, but it's transitioning, and this $2.5 million helps that property transition, right? We will have a whole bunch of infrastructure on that property that through the lease agreement we're required to deal with, and to get it ready for development to on its next use, which will be development for the town of Richland. So really important there. You know, this is the sort of thing where we will hope to trade or auction this property to buy replacement lands so that we can keep functioning and bringing in revenue for our trust. The next one is Ag Trust Operating. It says 4.2 million. I want to highlight that that's a total ask. It's actually, what we're trying to highlight right here is that it's an additional 1 million from what we have been asking for, or what we received this biennium. There's a lot of work we can be doing on our Ag Trust lands, and that additional $1 million will allow us to get to that work. So that's just, even though it says 4.2, it's a $1 million increase. Community forests is next. The department manages 2 community forests, the Tiana Way and the Klickitat. We have a lot of the partnerships that have been built over time there with other government and nonprofit organizations, as well as tribal governments, is almost unbelievable to me, and exciting, right? And we've got a lot of work in the pipeline we want to do around providing access, doing restoration work, and so we need this funding to be able to continue doing that great work. Next slide. And it looks like I am turning this over to Angus to bring us home.
All right, thanks very much, Brock, and thanks, Dwayne. So, very quick summary here. Obviously, you know, the focus of our legislative packet for the agency has been across really post-COVID recovery. So really about job creation is what we've really focused many of our asks on, as you can see, There's some linkage to jobs being created. Obviously, community resilience and agency efficiencies. And also two of the main priorities that the agency is also trying to support for the state, which is climate resiliency and the salmon recovery. So those being the sort of major focuses of the package, particularly in state lands, we think we can really contribute to these priorities and to these focuses. Yes, there's a big number there in the total number for the capital ask, and again, we're focusing around capital with interest rates being particularly low at the moment. We think that this is a really good investment, not only for state trust lands and for our natural areas and community forests, which Brock has touched on, but also it's a good investment for the state as well. We hope they're going to, we've given you an estimate of the jobs that we think this will create, and the linkage to some of those other priorities, such as community resilience and agency efficiencies. A few of the statute changes that we're looking at are really a prelude to the trust land performance work that we've been doing with Deloitte and Earth Economics, which we will be delivering a report later this month, beginning of November, to the legislator on. So with that, I just want to touch on the sort of next steps that we've been doing is sort of these continuing conversations with tribes, stakeholders, and beneficiaries. We have submitted our package, Mr. Cahill, to OFM. This was an old slide back in September, so that has been submitted. We're hoping that the governor will support all of our asks, of course, in his budget, as well as taking it into session. I do want to touch on a couple of the comments that was made earlier by various individuals about trust land transfer and why it's not part of this package and what we're doing about it. We did really seriously think about trust land transfer as part of one of the asks here. And as we balanced it up against those focuses and priorities that I talked about before, we felt that it was probably better not to make that ask this time around, given that we've actually struggled in previous biennia to get the legislators' support around that program. And so as an alternative, we were going to be convening a set of groups with stakeholders to re-examine that program and revitalize it over the next year or so. You will see, I think most folks that will see as part of our trust land as part of our trust performance assessment, that the ability and tools to transfer and transact land are going to be important for diversifying the asset classes of the trusts, and also being able to conserve lands that have significant either ecological importance or recreation importance for the state. So the program itself is really vital for us. So I hope we're not trying to sending a message broadly that is distracting folks from saying that we're not interested in the trust land transfer program for this biennium. We are. However, we feel that it should be revitalized and refocused on. And so we'll be convening groups to help us, get that revitalization into the program for future biennium. That's all. With that, I'll leave it for any questions. Back to you, Commissioner.
Yeah, one thing I just want to say on that piece, and then definitely open up for any closing comments, questions. My team is learning that my appetite is oftentimes larger than the legislative stomach. And it's always the biggest, most difficult thing is trying to figure out, what is the full ability of the legislature given so many pressing needs, as we know. And COVID has only exacerbated that. And there was a number of things that we all pushed, and really including myself, about what we wished for and wanted to continue to move forward this coming session, based on conversations with legislators around the state, about where their priorities are, where their focus will be, where there is really actually opportunities, we have had to make some tough decisions. That doesn't mean we're not coming back in future years. And as Angus just pointed out, one that is very near and dear to my heart, and obviously to many, many community members, which is the trust land transfer and just sheer investment in conservation and recreation and land opportunities. I think our forest action plan that will be coming out in the next few months will actually show the crisis that's in front of us when it comes to the conversion and threats to working forest land on the west side, as well as the forest health issue, and the critical need for investment at the state level. I will say, and I just have to add on to this piece of recreation, I think we and the people of Department of Natural Resources have been big recreation proponents, big supporters. We're big recreationists ourselves. It's been hard to get the attention and the investments at the state and federal level, though the federal government has stepped up quite significantly with the Land and Conservation Act at an unprecedented level this year. But I think one of the things COVID has done is really shown how important these landscapes are for the people of this state, not only for the economic opportunity, the environmental benefit, but for the sheer purpose of healthy well-being and quality of life. And I think we have to leverage this moment as we look out over the next 5 to 10 years and what we're going to do to make sure these public lands are available, they're managed well, they return for our beneficiaries, but they also, in a larger scale, from all of our recreation programs, all of our lands and waters programs, we're making them available to the public. So I'll turn it over. Questions, comments, board members, and thank you to the team for that great presentation. A lot of information. Okay.
Looks like you've all about today.
We've been either purely exhausted everybody or made them completely happy and content. I'll take the latter one since the day is still ahead of all of you. I think with that, this concludes our board meeting and appreciate everyone's time and attention to the public that engaged, to the board members. Obviously, a lot of information, a lot of to be presented. I'm looking forward to conversations on this. And thanks to the team. I know that a lot of work went behind much of what was presented today, and appreciate the leadership of the agency and the people working tirelessly to deliver. So with that, good job, you guys. Be safe, be healthy, enjoy, take care.
Thanks, bye.
Okay, everyone.